One thing that I'm interested in as well as it being, as we can see, a very complicated system. So it's easy for errors to creep in the more complex the system gets. What's the developer doing at this stage? I mean, how do you miss some of these? I suppose is what I'm wondering. There must have been some that were known problems.
Yeah, so that's really what came out in this court case. What the court case was asked to resolve is who should be responsible for the losses that the sub-postmasters are reporting. But that's an incredibly big challenge. So they split the trial up into different phases. So the first phase was to deal with the contract. So it did touch on some technical things, but not so much. There were some intermediate trials to do with disclosure, but then the one that was particularly interesting for people like me was the Horizon issues trial, and that was there to decide whether Horizon was robust. So there was lots of discussion about what robust means, but the way that the teams looked at this was to see what bugs were known about in Horizon, how these were dealt with, and then from that try to decide whether Horizon meets these criteria of being robust or not. And so the people who are responsible for maintaining the system, so Post Office for having overall responsibility, the subcontractor was Fujitsu, there was also element to deal with this synchronization, which was called Riposte. So they do keep detailed information about what sort of problems they encounter, but a pattern that seemed to come up is that there was a temptation for the Post Office to blame sub-postmasters for system problems. So even in cases where it was a bug, it was definitely a bug, it was even written down in the report as a bug, the conclusion was sub-postmaster made a mistake. And that was termed user error bias. And the judge was quite critical of the Post Office in that respect. So that was one thing that came out. Another thing came out is that some elements of the Horizon system were quite inclined to create problems. So they, for example, had the 0 key and the double 0 key next to each other on the keyboard. So if you accidentally mistype something, then you're off by a factor of 10. So that's something that quite easily could cause a shortfall. And again, that would be classed as a user error, but really there is a design problem in the system that causes these sorts of things to happen and then not be quickly detected.
Sometimes this can be as a result of a system kind of evolving rather than being designed and thought about properly. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's what's happened here? Has this grown out of something else and become kind of slightly unwieldy?
Yeah, so Horizon, again, it sounds like one system. Actually, it's a changing system and it's built out of components. And its creation was actually quite troubled. It was intended to be a partnership between the Post Office and the Department of Work and Pensions, and it'd be used for things like benefits payments, pension payments by DWP, and then by the Post Office for doing all those sorts of things. And it was designed to do both of these things, and it probably made some compromises in the process. But then it turned out that DWP, for whatever reason, didn't want it. The Post Office were stuck with it, and maybe those design decisions that were made for the DWP were not appropriate for the Post Office. So that probably made it more expensive and harder at the beginning. But also Horizon changed over time. So for example, it was never designed to deal with foreign transfers, foreign money. But now if you want to get some dollars out of the Post Office, they'll be happy to do that. And again, problems have been encountered in that particular application. So for example, it had rounding errors. So it wasn't just out dealing with pennies, it now had to deal with fractions because that's how foreign currency transactions work. And sometimes it would get things a tiny bit wrong because they were using probably floating point representation of numbers. But then if you add up all these rounding errors, it becomes something significant, and that caused the balancing to fail because accounts balance when it equals 0, not when it almost equals 0. So even if all these rounding errors are actually quite small, it will still cause a failure in balancing because a fraction of a pence is still not causing it to be balanced accounts.
What's the state of the system now? Have they fixed a lot of this stuff? Do you know?
It's certainly improved. So one of the conclusions of the trial is that the original Horizon was not robust. So that was the Horizon, which wasn't connected to the internet, and the terminals were offline most of the time, and then they did the synchronization. Eventually, the internet became sufficiently available and sufficiently reliable that the post offices could be connected by an ADSL connection, and that could be permanently online. And now you didn't need to do this every so often synchronization. You just assumed that the internet would be available, and then a transaction did not go through until it had gone to the post office headquarters, been accepted, and then went back. So that resolved a lot of the system challenges, and it did seem to make Horizon more reliable. There was also various fixes that went in over time. For example, one was to do with the lottery. So you can buy lottery tickets in the post office, and this is using a completely different computer to do the scanning of the slips and dealing with all of that. And initially, it was mostly manually synchronized between the lottery computer and the Horizon terminal, and this caused errors, and the post office knew that there were a significant number of errors coming from this, and so they made an improvement to do this automatic synchronization, and then they found that the errors went away. So I think the conclusion of the trial was that although the original version of Horizon was not reliable, the subsequent versions of this were better. But what also changed was the post office's attitude. What this trial forced the post office to do is disclose a lot of the problems they knew about. Before, they said that none of this existed. And so now their attitude has significantly changed, and there's been none or maybe almost no prosecutions since this trial was actually taking place, and that's more to do with the change in attitude and change in management rather than to do with the computer system itself.